There is a terrifying phenomenon happening all across the world on farms that most people don't know about. Workers show up in the morning, get to work in a particular area, something happens, and then they leave in a body bag. And although this is a danger commonly known to farmers, it keeps happening anyway. In fact, by some measures, this phenomenon is on the rise. So in this video, we're going to look at what exactly is happening on farms across the world, along with a few other horrific stories. And as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. It's a job that most people pass by without a second thought, someone up on a roof, laying shingles, or spreading tar under the blistering sun. But behind that everyday sight is actually one of the most dangerous professions in the United States. In 2018, data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics ranked roofing fourth on the list of the 25 deadliest jobs in the country. By 2023, it had risen to third, just behind logging workers and commercial fishing and hunting. And it's not hard to see why. Roofing combines all the hazards of construction, like heights, ladders, heat, power tools, and unstable surfaces, with the added challenge of working in unpredictable outdoor conditions. Whether it's the extreme heat in the summer or the ice-slick shingles in the winter, roofers are constantly operating in environments that turn even a routine task into a potential life or death situation. And in fact, roofing is one of only 4 professions where the fatality rate tops 50 deaths per 100,000 full-time workers each year. From 2003 to 2013 alone, more than 3,500 construction workers, a category that includes roofers, died from falls, and most of them were preventable. And behind these statistics and figures are real people with real families and real futures that were cut short. In 2004, one of those stories unfolded on a chilly October morning in Torrington, Connecticut. A 21-year-old roofer named Robert kissed his wife and baby daughter goodbye one morning and then went to work like any other day. It was just past 11 a.m. on October 15, 2004, and 6 men were on the roof of Warner Theater's Nancy Marine Studio in downtown Torrington. 2 other workers were assisting at the street level, and they were part of a larger crew working to repair the aging structure. The setup was also typical of a tar roofing job. On the ground next to the theater sat a tar kettle about 3 feet or 1 meter deep, filled with 300 gallons of molten hot roofing tar. This bubbled away at temperatures between 475 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit or 246 to 260 degrees Celsius. A pipe then ran from the kettle up to the roof, where the men would spread the tar across the surface as they worked. As the work continued, Robert was pushing a bucket across the rooftop when suddenly he slipped, and in a terrible instant, he plummeted headfirst to the street below and directly into that bubbling vat of tar. 2 of the men then rushed to pull him out, one of them being Robert's own father-in-law, and both the men were burned in the process, one of them so badly that he needed to be airlifted via helicopter to a burn center. For Robert, though, the ordeal was almost instantly fatal. From the moment he basically touched the tar, he was gone. In the parking lot behind the theater, the rest of the crew gathered. Some wept openly. One man with his face and clothes spattered with tar wandered in circles with his head down, unable to speak. Another leaned against a brick wall, shielding his eyes with a trembling forearm. Police were then called, and investigators from OSHA arrived shortly after, along with the city's building inspector. Evidence was then collected, and photos were taken while questions were asked to witnesses who could compose themselves enough to form a coherent sentence about what took place. As the investigation wore on, the findings would cast a long shadow onto the roofing industry and the roofing company in particular. The company had been cited for 8 separate safety violations related to the project, and 2 of those violations were for failing to provide a fall arrest system, which is basically safety gear that's supposed to catch a worker before they plummet. You can think harnesses attached to ropes or fall guards set up at the edges of the roof. Unfortunately, none of that equipment was in use at the time of the incident. And it wasn't the first time the company had been in trouble either. Just 3 years earlier, they'd been fined for the exact same thing. Robert's autopsy later confirmed what police suspected at the scene on the day of the accident. He died from asphyxia by submersion and thermal injury. In plain terms, he fell into the vat, couldn't breathe, and was burned in an instant. And tragically, it's not hard to imagine how this could have been prevented through the use of proper safety equipment. Any effort to protect the workers on the roof that day could have interrupted the chain of events that led to that rooftop slipping out from under Robert's feet, yet none were in place. October 29, 2013 started out like the previous workday for the technicians on site at the Piet de Wit wind farm in a village in the southwest of the Netherlands. It was the second day of a maintenance job on one of the wind turbines, which was a pretty routine task for the team that specialized in turbine upkeep. 4 workers were up inside the nacelle, which is a capsule that sits at the top of the tower, housing the turbine's generator and mechanical parts. They were nearly 230 feet or 70 meters above the ground, carrying out preventative maintenance on a Vestas V66 turbine that had been operating for about a decade. These kinds of machines are massive, powerful, and usually reliable, but like anything with moving parts, they require regular attention. Among the team of 4 atop the turbine that day were 19-year-old Dan and 21-year-old Arjun. Both of them were from small towns in the Netherlands and had joined the team as part of a new generation of turbine technicians. It was interesting and potentially dangerous work for sure, but like any job, there's a kind of routine that sets in when nothing goes wrong and when jobs are long but uneventful. As the work of the day continued in the nacelle, everything seemed to be going according to plan until, without warning, smoke began to fill the space, and a moment later, the first flames cropped up. The source was quickly traced back to the generator, and while the exact cause was never officially confirmed, investigators believed it started with a short circuit. Inside that cramped steel housing so high off the ground, though, the fire spread fast. Wind turbine nacelles aren't exactly fireproof, as they're packed with electrical components, hydraulic systems, and flammable fluids. And on top of that, there's not much room to move, and once a fire takes hold, escape options are limited. And so, the blaze quickly cut off access to the ladder and blocked any easy route down to the safety on the ground. 2 of the technicians managed to react fast. One person later said they jumped through the flames to reach a narrow staircase. It was a desperate move that could have cost them their lives, but instead, it saved them. They were later seen on the ground, dazed but alive, thanks in part to their quick thinking. For Dan and Arjun, however, there was no clear way out. Because of their location and how quickly the fire spread, they were trapped on top of the nacelle as it raged. As this was going on the ground, a photograph of the wind turbine was taken, and it would quickly make headlines around the world. 2 figures stood high above the earth, surrounded by smoke, and they appeared to be embracing one another. This photo, which has made the rounds on social media under the title "The Last Hug," was a brief moment of stillness in the middle of pure chaos. And it was a snapshot of what no one should ever have to face, the realization that help isn't coming fast enough and there's no way out. In that moment, the 2 young men had 2 choices: either jump to escape the fire or wait for the fire and smoke to overtake them. In the end, each man would make a different choice, but tragically, neither survived. As this tragedy was unfolding, fire crews arrived quickly, but getting to the top of the burning wind turbine isn't something you can do with a standard ladder truck. The nacelle was roughly the height of a 20-story building, and the fire was already raging by the time responders arrived. So for hours, the blaze burned unchecked. The turbine's height, combined with the remote location and the intensity of the blaze, made it nearly impossible for local crews to get close. It wasn't until a unit arrived with a large crane that anyone could even begin approaching the nacelle, and by then, the damage was already done. Once the flames were extinguished and it was safe to enter, the remains of one of the technicians was found in the charred wreckage above. The other had already been recovered from the field below. On the night of July 27th, 2010, something was eating away at Wyatt. At 14 years old, he was full of promise and personality, and just 2 weeks earlier, he'd reached a major milestone in a teenager's life. He got his first job. When he started, his excitement was through the roof, but after just 2 weeks, he was ready to move on to something else. This wasn't just some predictable teenage hang-up about not wanting to work, though. A life in agriculture isn't for everyone, and maybe Wyatt had already learned that he just wasn't cut out for it. But that July night, he admitted to a family friend that this was instead about fear. You see, Wyatt was working at a company just outside of Mount Carroll in Illinois, and most of his time there thus far had been spent inside the gigantic grain storage bins. Wyatt quickly grew to hate the bins and even joked with his family friend that he never wanted to see another kernel of corn in his life, although he didn't laugh after making the statement. There was a real truth to what he was saying. The bins had come to scare him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on why. But in any case, Wyatt decided to tough it out and give it a few more chances before he decided whether to stay or quit and find something else to do with his summer. The next morning was sweltering and the heat made the air feel heavy, especially inside the grain bins. Wyatt joined 19-year-old Alex and 20-year-old Will, two slightly older friends who were also on crew that day, and together they carried shovels and pickaxes up the ladder of a towering grain bin. These bins come in a variety of sizes, but this one was particularly massive. It was 4 stories high with a capacity to store 500,000 bushels of corn. The task for the 3 employees that morning was to do something known as walking down the grain. That's the industry term for breaking up grain that's stuck together so it flows more freely to the bottom of the bin. This is surprisingly hard and dangerous work, and so much so that OSHA regulations explicitly prohibit it to be performed by minors and restrict it at large commercial operations. But the company, like many small facilities, either wasn't subject to these rules or outright ignored them. The boys then used their shovels to push the corn toward the cone-shaped drainage hole at the bin's center, but around 9:45 a.m., something shifted and Wyatt began to sink. Corn, especially when flowing, sort of behaves like quicksand. You can quickly go from standing on a seemingly solid surface to that surface disappearing beneath your feet. Wyatt was then pulled under fast within seconds. His friends saw him go down and then rushed to help him and tried desperately to grab him and pull him back to the surface, but it was hopeless. Realizing how bad this was, Will shouted to another coworker near the exit ladder, telling him to run to the control room and shut off the conveyors, which he did, but by then it was too late. Wyatt had already disappeared deep beneath the surface. Alex and Will didn't abandon him though, as they stayed behind, still trying to dig him out, but they quickly found themselves in similar trouble. Both Alex and Will start to sink fast as well, first to waist deep, then deeper. Over the next few moments, Alex would be buried up to his neck in corn, and Will would be buried up to his shoulders. Still able to use his arms though, Will did his best to clear corn from Alex's mouth, trying to keep him breathing as the corn slowed down to a trickle as the conveyors turned off, but eventually Alex slipped under too. Will, meanwhile, stayed conscious and had no choice but to turn his attention to keeping his own airway clear. Emergency rescue crews arrived at the scene shortly afterward and were able to get Will tied off before he slipped beneath the surface of the corn, but Wyatt and Alex weren't so fortunate. They had become so buried in the corn that their lifeless bodies weren't recovered until after 10 p.m. the same night. Tragically, both of them had suffocated. It was later learned that on the day of the incident, Will had been working there for about a week. For Alex, it was only his second day on the job, and Wyatt, at 2 weeks, was the grizzled veteran of the three. None of them had been trained in grain bin safety, nor were they provided with proper protective equipment. Wyatt also shouldn't have been in the bin at all, as federal labor laws made it illegal for someone his age to even enter it, and yet, there he was, sent to do a job that would eventually kill him. All his fears about the bins were well-founded and sadly realized. After an investigation was done, OSHA fined the company $550,000, which was one of the largest penalties the agency had issued at the time. Still, no amount of money could bring back Wyatt and Alex, nor wipe away the trauma Will had to endure by watching his friends slip under right in front of him. What happened that day wasn't some freak accident. It was a well-documented, well-known danger of agricultural work known as grain entrapment and engulfment. This was also a textbook case of what is called active grain flow. In fact, it happens all the time. Understanding what happened begins with understanding how something as ordinary as grain can become so lethal. Grain entrapment begins when someone gets caught in a shifting mass of grain. It often starts small as a foot sinks in and then a leg, but once the grain reaches waist level, escape becomes almost impossible without outside help. And engulfment takes it further. That's when a victim is pulled completely under, buried alive in a sea of corn, soybeans, oats, or wheat. And as horrifying as it sounds, it's almost always fatal because when grain moves, it isn't so much a solid or even a liquid, it acts like something in between, and its speed catches most people off guard. Getting trapped knee-deep can take just 4 seconds, and total engulfment can happen in under 20 seconds. If you think about that, that's less time than it takes to tie your shoes before you completely vanish. Part of this danger lies in the physics of these massive grain bins. When grain is being emptied from the bottom, like it was in Wyatt and Alex's case, it creates a suction effect that pulls anything on top of it downward. And again, it's not a slow, gradual process. Grain can move extremely fast through an opening at the bottom of a bin. And then, even once the grain stops flowing, that doesn't necessarily mean the danger is past. If a victim is partially buried, the still grain can act like concrete as pressure around the body can lock it in place. Even if someone is conscious and breathing, they still can't move. And in fact, researchers have tested this and they found that if the grain reaches your knees, you might still get out without help. At the waist, you're already stuck, and once it reaches your chest, rescue requires serious equipment, coordination, and a whole lot of time, which most victims simply don't have. The weight of the grain can also make things extremely dangerous inside bins. Pulling someone out of waist-deep grain takes around 400 to 600 pounds of force. If someone is fully engulfed, you're looking at 900 pounds of force or more. That's like the equivalent of trying to yank someone out of a concrete mold, and it comes with severe injury risks. And then all of that comes before you get to the real killer in the grain pile, which is suffocation. Engulfment can do it by crushing the chest alone, but more often victims suffocate when fine particles fill their noses and mouths, or there's simply nowhere left to breathe. Even if a small air pocket exists, the pressure on the chest makes each breath harder than the last. One rare survivor of engulfment described it like having an 80,000-pound semi-truck parked on his chest. Another said it felt like the earth itself was swallowing him. And even when someone is lucky enough to keep their head above the grain, that's not the end of the story. For starters, most of these incidents don't happen in cities. They happen on farms, often small, family-run operations in rural areas, miles away from trained emergency crews. Paramedics and firefighters are often not just a few minutes down the road. The people responding first are often friends, coworkers, or relatives who are just as unprepared as the person trapped. Even the spaces themselves create significant rescue challenges. Grain bins are often confined, enclosed, and poorly ventilated, so getting into them safely is a daunting task on its own. Getting out with another person alive, though, is exponentially harder. The air doesn't make things any easier either. Spoiling grain releases gases like carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and other toxic compounds. In high enough concentrations, they can knock someone unconscious or even cause death. Rescuers who enter a bin without proper breathing protection can easily become victims themselves. And if rescuers do arrive with the proper tools, the process is still painstaking. To get someone out usually begins with isolating the victim from the surrounding grain. That means building a temporary wall out of plywood, sheet metal, tarps, or whatever else is available. Once in place, rescuers can begin carefully removing grain from around the victim, one bucket or one vacuum load at a time. Now, there are three main scenarios that lead to entrapment and engulfment, and we've already covered the first, which is active grain flow. The second biggest risk is spoiled grain that's gone out of condition, but it's not what you think. When this happens, it can form a hardened crust along the top of the bin, which can look like a solid floor. Underneath that crust, however, is likely just empty space and a hidden void. Tim Hansen, at 60 years old, knew the risks of what's known as a spoiled grain bridge, as he had spent a lifetime working on his family's farm near Dixon, Nebraska. He climbed inside the bin with a long pole one day in 2014, planning to break through a stubborn clog that had formed. His son Chris waited outside with a radio, keeping tabs on his father as a safety precaution. Suddenly, however, Tim stopped responding. Chris then banged on the bin, called out, and eventually climbed to the top, and when he looked down into the bin, there was no sign of Tim. All that remained was the pole that he had been using lying across the opening near the center. Chris then jumped in and started digging by hand, but there was nothing he could do. Tim had fallen through a bridge of spoiled grain and was swallowed within seconds. It took rescuers more than 2 hours to recover his body, which had sunk below 10 feet or 3 meters of corn. And the threat inside grain bins and silos doesn't always come from below. Sometimes the danger lies above. In bins where grain is spoiled along the sidewalls, it can harden and cling to the vertical surface. Eventually, someone has to dislodge it, and that's when the possibility of a literal grain avalanche comes into play. Matthew was just 20 years old when he was working with a crew cleaning a soybean bin in Goldfield, Iowa in 2008. As part of the job, Matthew stood near the discharge chute, helping guide soybeans out as his coworkers loosened the material attached to the bin's walls. When one particular area of grain broke free, though, it rushed through the bin toward the discharge chute. The flow then knocked Matthew off his feet and dragged him into the chute toward the conveyor belt sitting outside. His foot was then caught for a moment when a coworker tried to hurriedly close the gate, only complicating things. Nothing Matthew's colleagues could do was enough, though. They had no way to safely extract him from the sheer amount of soybeans that had become dislodged in that single swipe. With no time and no viable rescue plan, they were forced to reopen the chute and Matthew's body was carried further down into the system. He then tragically suffocated before anyone could reach him. What's worse is that Matthew had been wearing a fall harness that day, which is a standard procedure for the task at hand. The problem was he just forgot to clip himself to the lifeline that would have prevented him from falling before the work started. With this all taken together, it's easy to think that grain entrapments and engulfments are rare freak accidents or one-off tragedies, but the data tells a much darker truth. This is happening far more often than most people realize. Since 1964, at least 1,225 grain entrapments have been reported in the US, and that's just what's officially documented. Experts believe the actual number is likely higher due to underreporting, especially on small farms that operate outside the reach of federal oversight. More than half of all recorded incidents involve corn, and most of these occur in states across the Corn Belt like Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, and Ohio. These are areas where massive grain bins are everywhere, and harvest volume is enormous. And the real kicker in terms of numbers is that more than 70% of entrapments happen on small or family-run farms, which again are exempt from OSHA's grain handling safety regulations. In other words, the people most at risk are also the least protected by the law. In more recent years, grain bins have gotten larger, augers have gotten faster, and the capacity to move grain has increased dramatically, but these safety practices haven't kept up. In fact, while overall farm injuries have been trending downward lately, grain entrapments are on the rise. The most vulnerable groups are on the opposite ends of the age spectrum and include those younger than 17 years old and those older than 55. It's thought that the young often don't realize the danger until it's too late, and the old have been doing it so long that complacency sets in. And tragically, even with better rescue equipment and more public awareness, the odds of surviving an entrapment haven't improved much. Year after year, the fatality rate hovers at or above 50%, and in 2023 it hit a staggering 59.3%. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.